All right. Welcome to the, let's see, this is the third annual Research Blitz for the Philosophy and Religion Department. Thanks for coming. I'll try and keep my comments brief because this is supposed to be a way for everybody to get a really quick sampling of the research that's going on in the philosophy department. But just a few words to give everybody an idea what the procedure is and what's going to happen. Basically, there's going to be 12 speakers today. Everybody's going to have about less than 5 minutes. I will cut you off if you go beyond. What we're going to do is go speaker to speaker to speaker. There'll be a program in between each speaker, so everybody will be able to keep track of where we are in the events. So we're going to leave till the end if we have time, which we should. We'll have Q&A afterwards. And also, I just want to encourage everybody that if somebody's talking about research that you're interested in, please contact that faculty member to find out more. We're all interested in involving undergraduates in our research. Let's see. At the back of the room, there is a table with flyers about the various programs the philosophy department has and new courses for the spring, so take advantage of that. And there's refreshments, so take advantage of that. We're also going to, I just wanted to announce that we're going to institute a new research speaker series starting in the spring, which will feature works in progress from faculty members in the department and elsewhere. So you're invited to participate in that, and there'll be announcements about that on the department listserv. All right. Okay. So everybody's going to get 5 minutes. I get 5 minutes. I thought since I was already up here, I would take advantage of that, and then I would just stay out of the way unless I have to pull somebody off stage. So I'm Don Fallis. I usually work on the philosophy of lying and deception. That's been the main focus of my research for several years. But during the pandemic, in order to take my mind off of things, I sort of got obsessed by doing logic and probability puzzles. And as a result of this obsession, I've now involved in writing 2 papers on logic and probability puzzles. In particular, I'm interested in puzzles where there's some serious controversy about either what the right answer is or why it's the right answer. So one, probably the most famous example of this is what's known as the Monty Hall problem, where you're a contestant on a game show. There's 3 doors. Behind one of the doors is an expensive prize like a car, and there's a goat behind the other 2 doors. And what happens is you get to pick a door. In this case, you pick door number 3, and you get to keep what's behind door number 3. But before your door is open, Monty opens one of the other doors to reveal a goat. And now your question, and he says to you, now that you've seen the goat behind the door, do you want to switch to the other door? And so the question you have to answer is it more likely that the car is behind the door you initially picked or behind that remaining closed door, number 2? And seems like there's 2 closed doors remaining. It should be equally likely. But the official answer is actually that it's more likely to be behind door number 2. So that's probably the most famous example of the sort. There's other more recent ones. There's the TED Ed has this nice series of video riddles that you can watch every 2 or 3 months. One's the frog riddle, and basically the story is that you're stranded in the jungle. You've been poisoned. The only antidote is excreted by female frogs of a particular species. And the problem is that male frogs and female frogs are indistinguishable, except that male frogs croak. You hear a croak coming from a clearing and see two frogs there, and the question is, How likely is it that at least one of them is female? Seems like, well, there's the croaking frog, that's male. There's the other frog, 50-50. But Ted Ed says, it's like the Monty Hall problem. It's actually more likely that it's going to be the other frog's going to be female. And then there's another one that sort of blew up the internet about 5 years ago, Cheryl's birthday puzzle, where you have this conversation between two characters about when Cheryl's birthday is, and we're supposed to be able to figure out when Cheryl's birthday is by using the information about what they're able to figure out about what Cheryl's birthday is. And there's an official answer, and then there's people saying the official answer is wrong. So I'm working on a puzzle on this with a couple other philosophers, and including a Northeastern undergrad, or was Northeastern undergrad, now a grad, and I'm working on a paper on that. But I'm also teaching a course in the spring on information on uncertainty, like how do you deal with reasoning about uncertain events. We've all gotten a crash course in some sort of real world applications of this, like if you test positive for COVID, how likely is it that you have the disease? If you test negative, how likely is it that you don't? But it's often useful in order to understand how to update how to reason about probabilities to deal with some of these toy examples that come from these probability puzzles. So in my course, we're going to look at a lot of probability puzzles, including the frog riddle there. So the frog riddle says, well, there's 4 different possibilities for the distribution of the 2 frogs in the clearing. You hear a croak. That eliminates the possibility that there are 2 females there. So there's 3 possibilities remaining. 2 out of 3 are female, have a female on there. So you think it's that it's a 2/3 chance that other frog is female. Or is that the right answer? Come to my class next semester and find out. Okay, let's see. So we're going to just make one slight detour in the schedule. I'm going to have Adam come up and present right now, and then we'll move on with the schedule as stated there. Oh, thank you.
Thanks, Don. Hi, I'm Adam Hussein. I'm a professor here in the philosophy department. I am currently writing a book about discrimination, and I'm just going to mention some ideas from that book. So a core idea of the book is that we should connect the idea of discrimination with the idea of inclusion. Inclusion meaning the ability of people to participate in society, especially participate as equals. And what I wanted to do today is just mention very quickly 2 different ideas of inclusion that I think we should take seriously. The first idea is, I think, a bit more familiar. So the idea is we've got various positions in society that are attractive, jobs that pay well, political positions that come with a lot of power, and so on. And we have some idea of what it is to perform those positions well, to do that job well, and we also know we know what kind of skills you need to do those jobs well. And so first order inclusion is about it's about noticing that there are members of underrepresented groups who have the skills that we think are needed to do those jobs, but aren't getting them. So let me give you an example, and that's going to help me lead into the other idea of inclusion. So suppose you've got a firm that's hiring managers, and they take it at this firm that what's involved in being a really good manager is being really firm with your subordinates, being kind of aggressive, taking a stern turn of voice when needed, and so on. And then it might be that this firm has been hiring disproportionately men for these managerial roles. And one thing you might point out is you might say, hey, wait a minute, there are lots of women who could perform that role as described. So maybe they're not getting hired because there are these stereotypes that women can't be aggressive or can't be assertive and so on. So first order inclusion pushes us to think about who is not getting these positions, even though they have the skills that we normally take to be required to do those jobs. Second order or higher order inclusion is about something else. It says, hey, wait a minute, we've got all these assumptions about what these jobs look like and what they should look like, and we've got all these assumptions about what it takes to do them well, but we should actually stand back and ask, who's getting to make those decisions, these prior decisions about what the jobs look like in the first place and what counts as doing them well and what counts as having the skills to do them well. So in the case of these managerial jobs, somebody might say, hey, wait a minute, why are we assuming that the best possible manager is necessarily someone very aggressive? Why are we assuming that the best possible manager has a more kind of always assertive, dominant role in the workplace and isn't a more collaborative person? It might be that doing that job better actually involves having a more collaborative approach, taking more account of what other people have to say, and so on. That might be better for the bottom line of the business, and it might be better for other reasons too. It might make the lives of the workers, for example, of that firm happier, and it might involve them being treated with more dignity. So first order inclusion, about getting people into these positions as we currently understand them. Second order or higher order inclusion, about opening space for people to challenge, especially members of underrepresented groups, the way that we think about those jobs in the first place, and what they're for, what it is to do them well. I'll give you a few more examples just to try and get a little bit clearer on what the idea is. Take, for example, the police. So historically, the police has been disproportionately white, and some people have said, hey, wait a minute, why aren't they hiring people of color? And again, stereotyping has been part of it, just the assumption that to be a good police officer, you necessarily have to be white. But somebody might say, well, you know, even if we take the police as traditionally defined, what are you supposed to do? Go around, catch criminals, whatever it may be. No, there are lots of people of color who can do that. But we notice, and this is something that various scholars have talked about, that even when forces hire a higher percentage of people of color, they still often have some problems with, for example, police brutality, of exploitation of poor communities of color, and so on. So there's this further question that we can ask, which is not just, are there people of color who can do the job as normally defined, but how should we define that job in the first place? What should the police actually be for, and what is it to be a good police officer? Maybe being a good police officer is about having closer connections to the community. Maybe being a good police officer is about knowing when you should stand back and allow other people to intervene, such as mental health experts and so on. Maybe being a good police officer is about actually trying to scale back the involvement that you have in certain communities. So so while first order inclusion is about getting more people of color into jobs in the police force as traditionally understood, higher order inclusion is about allowing members of especially poorer communities of colors to have a greater say in what the police do in the first place, and how police are trained, and what is understood to be a police officer. I don't mean to say that the idea of higher order inclusion is something that I just kind of came up with myself and that hasn't shown up at all previously. I think it's an idea that we can use to unite a lot of historical and contemporary social movements. So just to give you an illustration, I want to briefly read you a quote from Kwame Ture, then speaking in Stokely Carmichael. Quote, "Let me make one thing clear. I'm not saying that the goal is for all blacks and other excluded persons to be allowed to join the middle-class mainstream of American society as we see it today. For to do that," he was saying, "would be to ignore the issue of who gets to define the roles and institutions of middle-class society in the first place." He's responding especially to President Johnson's idea of the Great Society. Quote, "President Johnson's concept of the Great Society is preposterous. The definition comes from him, as does the means of entering that society. Excluded people must acquire the opportunity to redefine what the Great Society is, and that it may have meaning. I place my own hope for the United States in the growth of belief among the unqualified that they are in fact qualified, that they can articulate and be responsible and hold power." So I think that's him saying we shouldn't just care about first order inclusion, we should care about higher order or second order inclusion. Thank you.
Okay, hi everyone, I'm Jacob Stump. I teach philosophy here. I'm going to briefly describe 3 research projects. Here's the first one, it's my main research project. I'm asking the questions, what is it to value something? What is to value something the most? What influence does that have on the rest of your mental life? Can philosophy be effective at changing what a person values the most? For instance, can philosophy be effective at getting someone who values power more than anything else, instead to value something like wisdom, truth, or virtue more than anything else? And what obstacles are likely to interfere with this? Things like motivated reasoning, wishful thinking, or defensiveness. I'm fascinated by these questions. I think they're interesting on their own, but I researched them in the context of Plato's dialogues. That's not an arbitrary choice. Of all the philosophers in the history of philosophy, Plato is the philosopher most concerned with the importance of what a person values the most. He depicts Socrates in the Apology saying, here's what I'm all about, changing what people dedicate their lives to. And then Plato depicts Socrates in many dialogues actually trying to convert his interlocutors to different ways of life. He seems to fail. Every scholar's like, Plato thinks of Socrates as a failure. I disagree. If you want to know more, you can look at, I just had this article published in Philosopher's Imprint last year. I gave you the picture of it so you know what it looks like. Because if anyone's having trouble sleeping, you can just go find the article that looks like this and start reading it like 5 or 10 minutes before you want to fall asleep, and it should do the trick. That's a really big picture article. In my other research, I'm filling in the details. What I'm working on now is a paper on eros, erotic desire, erotic love in Plato. I don't know, has anyone fallen in love before? What has happened to you when you fall in love? Plato answers, you've had a new desire. And there's two types of desires you might now have. He has a conception of eros that comes in two kinds. You might find that now you desire something. It can be a person or an activity or really anything. You might find that now you desire something insofar as it gives you a certain sort of pleasure, a pleasure that's unique to experiences of beauty. Or you might find you've just fallen in love, and what has happened to you is you now desire something insofar as you consider it to be central to happiness or what makes life worth living. This second type of eros is for Plato the most important part of a person's mental life. Something I think is really cool with it is that it can't be changed on the basis of reasoning. It's pretty easy to see why. You desire something insofar as it's central to happiness. One thing that requires is that the object of that desire is what you value the most. It's then what you use as your standard of value. So you won't judge anything ever to be more valuable than it, because for you, what is valuable in the first place is that thing. That's how you measure the value of something. That's very similar to an argument, by the way, we find in this dude named Harry Frankfurt, but Plato beat him to it by about 2,500 years. Okay, so that's what I'm working on now, and then I'll mention the third thing. I lead this working group in the philosophy department. It's called the Philosophy as a Way of Life Working Group. What we did last year is looked at empirical claims from Hellenistic philosophy, in particular Stoicism. They're empirical claims, so if we're going to figure out whether they're true, we have to do some empirical testing. That's what we did. We extracted 3 mental techniques from Epictetus's Enchiridion. It's the Handbook of Stoicism. And we measured how effective those mental techniques are at relieving anxiety in you all, Northeastern undergraduate students. So I'll briefly describe the techniques. Suppose you're anxious about something. First technique, identify what is under your control with that situation and what is not under your control. Don't worry about what's not under your control. Second technique, you're anxious about something. Imagine that some stranger would have the same thing in their life. How would you evaluate its importance in the stranger's life? Evaluate its importance in your life in the same way. Third technique, you're anxious about something. Identify all the possible outcomes and how it's possible for you to benefit no matter what. We recruited 60 undergraduate participants. We had these 3 groups and a control group. They went through a pre-baseline stage, a baseline stage, and an intervention stage where they use the techniques. They text us when they're anxious. They log the initial intensity of their anxiety. They then employ the technique. 5 minutes later, they get a text from us. What's the intensity of your anxiety now? 1 hour later, they get a new text from us. What's the intensity of your anxiety now? And what we found is of these 3 techniques, all taken from Epictetus's Enchiridion, only the benefit technique showed significant improvement in the participants' anxiety at both the 5-minute mark and the 1-hour mark. Here's the upshot. If you're anxious about something, think about how you can benefit from it. Okay, that's it. Thanks.
I am Sina Fazalpur. I'm a new assistant professor here at Northeastern. And so I'm very excited to see you. And I will be teaching human technology and human values next term. I don't know whether any of you is at the level that you would take that course, but if you are, I'm teaching it and I will be discussing some of the issues that I will talk about today. So most of my projects right now have to do in some way or another with how we as a society can make better decisions. And by better, I mean both functionally better, in terms of epistemic, philosophically speaking, and ethically better, in terms of justice, fairness, and other values that we might have. So I want to kind of talk about one, and if there's time, 2 projects that I'm working on in this respect. And these are kind of recent projects. So this first one has to do with issue of diversity and fairness in context where we have a group of people that are making sequential decisions. What does that mean? As the name suggests, in sequential decision making, each agent has a sequence of decision points, and at each point in time, they have to make a decision. They have a number of choices. What do they want to do at that point in time? When they decide on something, then they observe a feedback. Example, top left, you might have a doctor who's the decision maker, and at each point in time, she might face a cohort of patients. And her decision point is that she has to decide which of the 2 treatments she wants to give to these patients. So let's say that the first point in time she goes with treatment A, she observes that 61 out of 100 patients get better, right? Next point in time, she again has to make a similar type of decisions. This time she goes with treatment B, and she sees that 65 out of 100 patients get better, right? So this is kind of sequential decision making. You can kind of immediately notice 2 things about it. One, what you observe, the results that you get, depends on what you have chosen to do, right? You only see the recovery for the treatment that you have chosen. If you have not chosen the treatment, you don't see how people react to it. And 2, because of this, you face a kind of a dilemma. How does it work? At each point in time, you have to make a choice. What do you want to do? Do you want to go with the option that looks the best right now, your treatment B, because it had 65 successes? Or do you want to improve your knowledge of the other option that doesn't look that good, but maybe if you get to know it better, it turns out to be better, right? So you probably all have restaurants that you really like, but once in a while the food is not that great. But that can be misleading because overall, you really like the restaurant. And so similarly here, overall, treatment A might be better than treatment B. So this is the case of a medical research. But this type of decision making is the type of decision making that is also made by artificial intelligence agents. So in many different cases, in suggesting routes that you take when you use an app, in suggesting news items to you, or in many cases in educational settings, in suggesting tools for student support. Like what type of tutoring tools or hints or strategies best support a student learning, right? So we obviously want this type of decision making to be good in our society, especially when we are making it as a group. Now it turns out that when we are thinking about multi-agent systems, like scientific communities or artificial intelligence agents that are used on different types of websites and that are connected to each other, there are a number of factors that impact how good our decision making is. These are factors that have to do with the individual decision making, how does the individual act, what the strategies do they follow, as well as factors that have to do with the communication network. What is the structure of connection? Are there lots of connections between different agents, like this one could be a doctor, or actually there's only a sparse connection between them? How do they communicate with each other? Do they trust each other? So part of my work has looked at these type of things. But notice, we are missing some important issue here. Namely, we are treating all the patients or all the students in that case as if they are the same, as if they're homogeneous. But this is not true, right? People are different, the students have different needs, they come from different demographics, and patient demographics can be very important for whether they recover or not. Unfortunately, most work in philosophy, computational social science, and many works in artificial intelligence do precisely this. So in my work, I look at how we can disaggregate the benefits and disadvantages of different strategies for different groups. That would allow us to see whether a particular setting, network setting, a particular strategy is actually not just good overall on average, but also equitable, also fair in that way. I think I don't have enough time to go in more detail about it, but if you want, come talk to me in my office every day. And thank you.
Hey, is this good? Can you hear me okay? Hi, everyone. I'm Katie. I think I have a slide somewhere in here. My background is in philosophy of science. Oh, am I supposed to be? Sorry, I'm controlling the slides. Awesome. Thanks, Don. Yeah, just one slide. Okay, so my background is philosophy of science. What I really want to talk to you about today, though, is how that work in philosophy of science has informed the creation of my new dialogue. So it's for summer 2, this upcoming summer. I'm really excited about this dialogue experience. It's a really unique opportunity to study scientific revolution in London, and it's 2 parallel tracks, one in history of science and one in philosophy of science. So the 2 courses you would get in this dialogue, history of science and then a philosophy of science, focusing on scientific revolutions. So I'm doing this dialogue with a colleague of mine in the engineering department. So you would have 2 courses, one from me, one from Walid Malis in the engineering department. And the idea is that we have designed these courses to be in conversation with each other throughout the dialogue. So Walid will walk you through a timeline starting from the Renaissance through the computational revolution in the 20th century, and then I'll follow along with that timeline and talk about the pivotal moments in philosophy of science, talk about philosophers of science along the way. My course is more of a theme-driven course, whereas his course is more of a historical, timeline-driven course. But we talk to each other and with each other all along the way. So those are the courses. It's summer 2. We're based in London, but we travel a lot. So we take you out to Oxford, to Cambridge, Bath, Greenwich. We'll do a quick weekend in Paris. We visit observatories, museums, scientific centers. It's gonna be a really fun trip. So if you have more questions about the dialogue, I've got a flyer in the back. There's a QR code you can scan. We're doing an informational meeting for our dialogue the week right after we get back from Thanksgiving break. So it's that Monday, the 29th, 3:30 to 4:30 p.m. If you are interested and you want to talk about dialogue, understand everything we're doing on the dialogue, ask us all your questions, then join us right after break Monday. I'll send out a bunch of emails to make sure you know where to go. But that's the dialogue piece of what I'm working on right now. And yeah, it's my dream course. In every way, it's my dream course, not only because it's a travel-based course, but also because it allows me to pour my heart and soul into a course that is exactly the kind of platform that I want for the research work that I care about. Okay, so then I also want to talk really briefly about Ethics Bowl. I co-coach the Ethics Bowl team and the Bioethics Bowl team with Professor Yell. You'll hear from Yell in a few minutes. And I think this is selfishly kind of my pitch for another opportunity to get involved with our department. I would say Ethics Bowl is a type of research project similar to the work we do in our working groups in the department, because the whole semester, whether we're doing fall semester for Ethics Bowl or spring semester for Bioethics Bowl, it's a research-driven task. The research changes because we get 15 new cases every semester. So this fall semester, we marched through 15 cases in applied ethics, problem solving, puzzle solving along the way. We competed just 2 weekends ago, and Professor Yell may have a little bit more to say about the tournament. But I think what I want to focus on in terms of Ethics Bowl is that it's such a different debate experience from what I experienced in college. So my debating background in undergrad was what I now call the dark side of debate. I competed in parliamentary debate and Lincoln Douglas debate and some other little forums of supposedly like research-driven debate activities. But in the end, what I found, I just got so burned out because they were all about winning through these like tactics and strategies. I don't know, to give you one example, this like speed and spread tactic where you just throw out all the arguments you can and you put so many arguments out there that your competitors will never be able to respond back with successful objections to all the arguments you give. So you're kind of forced into this race to the bottom of giving as many bad arguments as you can to just spread your competition out of the round. What I love about Ethics Bowl is that it's a totally different style of debate. It's much more conversational. It's much slower. It's team-based, so you don't debate alone. You're with a team of 3 or 4 other people, and the judges cross-examine you. After you complete the regular speeches in the round, the judges have a time where they are asking you specific questions about your research, about your evidence, about your arguments. They're raising possible objections, counterexamples to which you have to respond to. So I love the fact that small tweak to the format forces teams to slow down, to think about the quality of their arguments rather than the quantity of their arguments. So I would invite you to join us in problem solving and research through Ethics Bowl. All right, that is my time, I think.
Clock. Hello, everybody. I'm Professor Sandler. I work on moral philosophy and environmental ethics and technology ethics. I'm going to talk about my work on extinction. This is an idealized representation of the standard conservation paradigm, which has been the standard since conservation biology became a field 40 years ago. Here's the idea. Can you see that? The idea is to limit and then repair human impacts on the environment that are negative. How do we do that? We do it with these kinds of strategies that are very place-based interventions in the place where the damage is occurring. So you either try to restore what's been done or you try to protect the space from having those damages. And the reason why we do that is because the idea is that accomplishing this end through these means here supports all these values. It's idealized, okay? And huge amounts of interesting philosophy over the last 40 years on this, a bunch of ethics work on these values, a bunch of philosophy science work on species, ecosystem health, a lot of work operationalizing this sort of stuff, like what kind of historical reference conditions do you use when you're restoring an ecosystem? And then lots of critical work on the whole paradigm, right? So does it make use of a problematic human-nature dichotomy sort of thing? Or how has it been used? Some of these especially. Where's mine? Those ones up there at the top, the landscape protections, have sometimes been misused in ways that have disempowered local communities and indigenous communities. So a lot of critical work on the paradigm itself. But something interesting is happening with respect to this paradigm it's starting to happen now. It's falling apart. Right? Even the internal logic is falling apart for 2 reasons, which I'll talk about really quickly. One is just the massive scale of species that are at risk. This is not the happy talk, right? Massive species at risk. The historical rate of species extinction is about 1 species per million species per year. There's about 10 to 15 million eukaryotic species, plant and animal species. So in a normal year, that would be good. All right. We're having it. Already we're at hundreds, probably thousands of species extinctions a year due to human impacts. Climate change is expected to raise that another order of magnitude to 10,000 species a year. On projections, we're talking about 15% of species going extinct by the end of the century. So for context, that background historical rate was 0.000001%. All right? So there's huge amounts of species that are at risk. And as climate change becomes the larger driver of those risks, it turns out that you can't use those local interventions to conserve the species. Why? Because it's background ecological and climatic causes that are making them at risk, right? So you can't conserve polar bears by designating their habitat critical habitat and by preventing hunting of them if it's higher global surface mean temperatures that are causing them to be at risk, right? Everybody got the problem? Right. So what this means is you can't accomplish for those kinds of climate risk species, you can't accomplish that goal by those means anymore, which means you either have to change the goal or change the means or both. So here's the heavy part, exciting times for environmental philosophy. Right? So lots of interest among conservationists in genetic technologies, the ways in which to use new genetic interventions. So things like gene drive, genetic modification, cloning, stem cell technologies, assisted reproductive technologies. So there's all these different programs and aims that I can't go into now that they're trying to develop. And there's a broad kind of discussion about whether or not the way to think about conservation anymore is about going back and undoing human impacts, right? Because one of the things that's interesting about climate change is it's like an ecological acceleration away, right? So does it make sense to think about undoing and going back, or do we need to take a more control-oriented approach, a more human-engineered approach to conservation going forward, right? So rethinking the goals, rethinking the strategies. All right, here's the research questions. Here's one. How do you conduct ethical evaluations of these novel strategies and projects, given that the background paradigm is coming apart, right? So in the past, people would just rely on that paradigm to make the evaluations of the strategies, but you can't do that anymore because the paradigm itself is coming undone. So that's one of the projects I've been working on, is trying to conduct ethics and values analyses of novel conservation interventions, novel conservation technologies. Here's an example of some that I've been working on. This one is to do with black-footed ferrets. If you want me to, okay, we'll talk about. We won't talk about too much about black-footed ferrets, which they're an at-risk species that there's a captive breeding and reintroduction program on in the United States. They have successfully cloned from cryopreserved tissue a black-footed ferret. This is on gene drives in general as a strategy, and this one is on a plan to repopulate the northern white rhino. Of the northern white rhino, there's 2 left in existence. Right? They're both female, but there's a bunch of cryopreserved material, so there's a strategy to do that. Here's another project. There's very little philosophical work on theorizing mass extinction. With respect to extinction, there was a lot of knowledge gained by thinking about how extinction matters or is significant above and beyond the deaths of all the individuals involved. Mass extinction, is there something significant going on here that we need to make sense of in addition to all the individual extinctions involved? So I've been working on that. Here's some papers related to that. And I got to sign. Okay. And this question of new paradigm. Should we take a more engineering control-oriented approach to conservation going forward? Been working on that as well. If you're interested in these sorts of things, there is a group of, so far a small group, but we're open to more people who are going to be thinking about some of these questions, doing some readings, maybe bringing some speakers starting in the spring semester. Reach out to me. Thank you very much.
Hi. Do I do my own slides here? Okay. Cool. Hey, my name is Professor Benjamin Yell. I'm a teaching professor here at Northeastern University. I'm going to take the opportunity to talk about my teaching for the spring. I'm involved in Ethics Bowl with Professor Shorey, so I'll mention that as well. First, my research is on the nature of the good life. So well-being. What makes our lives go well for us? Because that's my area that I'm interested in, I've incorporated that in my Introduction to Philosophy class. Do I have any of my students here right now? Yeah, hey. So in my Introduction to Philosophy class, we start off with yeah, we're doing ethics, by the way. Some intro classes try to do everything. Mine, I'm just like, forget it, we're doing ethics. And so we start off asking, what's good for you? What makes your life good? Is it pleasure? Is it having your desires satisfied? Is there some human good life that you should be getting yourself towards? And in all of these, I like to incorporate, and I'm inspired by my colleague, Professor Stump here, philosophy is a way of life. So in this class, for each unit we do in the class, I have my students live out one of their theories. So for instance, when we talk about well-being, I have my students live like a hedonist, a desire satisfaction theorist, or some sort of objective list theorist, literally for a week or two, take a journal on their experience, reflect on their experience, and then produce a vlog. Am I using the right word? A vlog. I have several students produce works of art, including dance or visual works of art. Students podcasted together, did a talk show with each other about that. From there, once we talk about what's good for you, we talk about ethics, normative ethics. What's the right thing to do? So many conflicts are about people's competing views for themselves. So how do we adjudicate those, right? So we'll talk about Kantian moral theory, utilitarianism, virtue ethics, social contract theory. After that, I make you live like a utilitarian. I don't make you, but like, you live like a utilitarian. I make you. A utilitarian, Kantian moral theorist or virtue ethicist. I make you live like that. Report on the experience, what it was like to try to follow one of these particular codes of ethics. Following that, we talk about metaethics. What are you even doing when you say that something's wrong, right? We call things right or wrong all the time, but what does that even mean? And then finally, we get into applied ethics. And I chose to do this last because it's my experience that when a lot of people are fighting about abortion, animal rights, they're just yelling at each other, right? But first, I train you up as a good ethicist so that you know what you're doing when you yell at each other. So we talk about the ethics of abortion, eating animals, letting immigrants into our country, whether or not it's okay to do drugs and things like that. And finally, my students are about to do that. I send them off into the wild to go find somebody they disagree with and trace out their argument with it. I'm doing it now so you can go home for Thanksgiving and fight with your crazy aunt or uncle. So I'm hoping that generates some really good conversations at the Thanksgiving table. And then they'll report on that. So for that, I want my students to find someone who they disagree with and then really trace out the root of that disagreement. Why does the other person disagree with you? Do they disagree about factual matters? Philosophical matters? Do they hold different values? And then explore the possibility of reconciliation. What would it take? What do we disagree with and how could we come to some sort of understanding? So that's my introduction to philosophy class. I also teach food ethics, which I'm teaching as well for this semester. This class seeks to look at all the different ethical dimensions of our current food system. So this is sort of like a rough sketch, but we start with things like this. Lots of people are starving in the world. Do we owe them anything? Food, aid. Do we owe them anything? And what, if anything, do we owe them? So we have an obesity crisis in the United States for a variety of reasons, but we clearly have enough, and a lot of people don't have enough. What should we do about that? Factory farms are super immoral. Anybody see any horrific factory farming videos? Yeah, they're super immoral. Yeah, really bad. Is it wrong to eat chicken and beef or pork that comes from them? Any vegetarians in the house? Nice, you're probably not making an effect. So does that change the moral calculus for you? Like, you're abstaining from it, doesn't really impact the system, so is it cool? Really? Quick, all right, cool. Can a sandwich be racist? Cultural appropriation. Does cultural appropriation have a place when we're talking about food? Local organic, are those nice movements that are meaningful? Is it just some yuppie bullshit? GMOs, do they give you cancer? Or are they actually fine? Banning big sodas. So, public health and paternalism. Like Professor Shori, I'm a co-coach of the Ethics Bowl and Bioethics Bowl teams. I'm the resident ethicist for that, so when you make your arguments, I'll be like, Kant didn't say that. Get your utilitarianism right. So, it's an awesome group of students where we get together weekly. We used to have pizza. We'll do it again at some point. To talk about and argue about really interesting topics, and we travel all over the country to compete with students who are interested in it as well. It's a great experience, one of the best things I've been doing at Northeastern for years. Thank you. Yeah, we have team members in the house, everybody. You can come talk to them, come to talk to us afterwards about how amazing it is. All right, thank you very much.
Hey everybody, I'm Professor Basil. I'm a moral philosopher with pretty broad interest in philosophy and philosophy of science, ethics. But most of my work recently is in ethics of technology, in particular ethics of AI. I'm going to talk about two projects in particular that I'm working on. The first has to do with issues of transparency. So some algorithmic decision-making systems, that is systems that do classifications and offer up predictions that get used for or in decision-making, are opaque, meaning even the people that build them and program them can't understand how inputs get transformed to outputs. And so this is often seen by many as a problem. And in this paper that I'm working on with Jeff Behrens and David Gray Grant, we defend what we call the interpretability thesis, which roughly says there's at least some contexts where decision makers should not rely on the outputs of black box algorithmic systems, or at least they have a strong reason not to rely on them, even if it's overridable. Now that's not a new thesis, lots of people defend that, but the standard way of defending that is to defend what we call a transparency standard. You lay out some informational standard that has to be met for an algorithm to sort of pass muster or to not count as opaque. Now, there are lots of defenses of that kind of move, but it gives rise to a kind of skepticism. And the skeptics say things like, well, it's a little unfair to hold algorithms to a double standard because either humans don't meet that transparency standard you've offered up, or algorithm systems can meet it to the same degree as humans. And so that's sort of how the dialectic is going right now. So instead we want to say like, well, even though the problem is opacity, let's not look for the source in a transparency standard. Instead, let's just ask really broadly, what is it that we owe to decision subjects across contexts? And we try to offer up a ton of different things, the different obligations we have to decision subjects, and then trace their implications for transparency. So like, when I'm forming beliefs about someone applying for a job, how should I take the evidence about them into account? Sometimes I should ignore available evidence. Sometimes evidence is morally inadmissible, like facts about race or class or things like that. And sometimes there are beliefs that there's things I should take into account in evidence that an algorithm can't, because they only can take in a certain kind of inputs. And so we try to explain how an algorithmic system that's opaque, we can't tell if it's appropriately incorporating evidence. But we also argue that we have certain duties to decision subjects that aren't about how we take into account evidence, but how we just consider the individual. Sometimes there are constraints on the moral principles we may rely on when making decisions about people. And sometimes we argue that there's actually, you have to exercise certain capacities when making decisions about people. And either algorithms don't meet it, or opaque ones, it's impossible to tell whether they've exercised those capacities, because some people are real liberal about what they mean by exercising cognitive capacities. So let me just give you an example of one of those to motivate that kind of reasoning, which we then develop a bunch of arguments for. But imagine we have this tool. What we can do is model juries. So you come in for jury duty. The lawyers select who the 12 people are going to be on the jury. But then we have this algorithmic system that's 99.99999% accurate at predicting what juries will find. And you can either imagine that it does it for each individual juror, or it does it collectively. It doesn't really matter. And we ask, is there something problematic with adopting jury model substitution for jurors? And we think intuitively there's something wrong with that. And then the question is, can we spell out the moral foundations of that? And we think we can. We think actually what legitimates the decision of a jury trial is that it's been adjudicated by a jury of your peers. Like, there's something about the structure of jury trials that requires that I exercise my capacity, my empathy capacities, my agency to make a decision about you. And so then that tells you something like you shouldn't use opaque algorithmic standards. It also explains, or you shouldn't use opaque algorithmic decision makers, and it explains why it's not a double standard. They actually just can't meet the requirements that we owe to decision subjects in certain cases. Or if you have that really liberal view about cognitive capacities, if it's opaque, you can't tell whether it's met those requirements. Okay, so that's how the paper goes, and we spell out the range of duties we have to decision subjects and try to explain how it connects up with the broader literature. And one of the things we really like about this project is that it really points us to doing deep normative work on like interpersonal relationships, because a lot of the rich stuff about what we owe to decision subjects comes from our interpersonal relationships. Like, I don't know what it's like to have children, but I assume that it's like, you can't be cavalier when making decisions about your children because you have certain duties regarding your spouse about how you should do decision making. And so you like have to consider both of them in a certain kind of way. And they're both parents, so they spell out that part of the paper. I just want to briefly touch on another project. This has to do with what we call robustness in classification. I'm working on this project with Danny Rasaby. He's a former student at Northeastern. He graduated about a year ago. This came out of my AI ethics seminar. Danny said, hey, what should I write a paper on? I said, I don't know, something about adversarial examples. Sounds cool. And then he came back and we started collaborating on this once he graduated. But the idea is this, that a lot of, 1 minute, is that what this is? 30 seconds. Okay, here's the deal. We develop a characterization of what it means for a computer system to be robust, because you can have a system that's highly accurate but still subject to failures like adversarial examples, like put a few stickers on a stop sign and a car will read it as a 50-mile-an-hour speed limit sign. And that's not best characterized as an accuracy failure, but as a robustness failure. So we develop a measure of robustness, and it's system neutral, and then we point out ways in which this can be useful for all sorts of classification tasks. One thing we think is cool is that that's a deep fake of President Obama. Deepfakes are adversarial examples for humans. So we have this notion of robustness that we can use to characterize these failures across different kinds of classification systems, and we point out how that can help us solve some of these problems. Okay.
I'm Professor Smead. I do sciencey, mathy kind of philosophy, and you're going to get a little example of that today. But the example is actually going to be primarily research that was done by my students, not by me. I'm part of the team, but I run the Rossetti Family Program for the Advancement of Humanities. The idea there is I'm trying to instill interest in humanities and philosophy in non-humanities students. So we oftentimes pick topics that are interdisciplinary. We have a couple of Rossetti students in the room right now, right up front here, and a couple others that have at least considered it. If you're interested in this kind of stuff, get in contact with me. We've got research projects going on. We've got a group that meets regularly. It's good fun. Okay, so a couple of years ago, Julian, Mac, and Danny got in touch with me, and they're like, "Hey, we're interested in doing some evolutionary modeling with you. Anything cool?" I gave them some books to read. We got together, did a research project, and we came up with an interesting. We noticed there was an interesting little puzzle in evolutionary biology. And the ways the puzzles in evolutionary biology happen is here's what the theory says, and then we notice some real examples that don't match up with the theory. So we got to figure out what's going on here. Here's the puzzle. Some prominent theorists here, Levins and Lewontin, and then the infamous and famous William Hamilton, suggest that if you have two competing species occupying the same niche, one of them should drive the other to extinction. You shouldn't see cooperating competitors. But then later, this is a quote from Susan Simmerd in 2020, we start finding tons of examples of interspecific cooperation of the gratuitous form that Hamilton was talking about. And so Susan Simmerd in particular identified cases where birch trees and fir trees were sharing resources with one another, despite the fact that they are quite literally competitors. They compete for the same resources in the same spots. So what's going on here? We build a little evolutionary model to try to figure this out. We do a little game theory, and we extend some existing frameworks. The basic idea here is that we imagine that there are two groups that are interacting with one another. They engage in interactions with their own type, and they engage in interaction with the other type, the types being species. So species A interacts with themselves, playing some kind of game with one another. Species B also interacts with themselves, playing some kind of game with each other. And then there's a game between the species. For simplicity, we assume the same game throughout. But different behaviors emerge in different contexts. So in this case, species A evolves internally in one way, and they settle on some sort of behavior amongst themselves. So does species B. But between A and B, they settle on a different form of behavior. This is sort of just a product of the way the modeling happens and tracks interacting species in some ways quite nicely. What happens here is that typically we do see that Hamilton and Levins and Lewontin intuition is totally right. When two species compete, one of them does usually drive the others to extinction. But in doing this modeling, we also found that there are interesting cases in which that doesn't happen. And not only do we get the stable existence of competing competitors, but we are able to identify the exact circumstances under which we expect this to happen. And here's how this works. So let me walk you guys through this. So look at that diagram in the upper right there. So we have two groups, A and B. There's a payoff that A gets from interacting with A. That's the pi A in. That's their in-group payoff. That's what happens when they interact with their own species. And then B has a similar payoff that they get when they interact with their own species. And then there's the arrows going the other way. So the pi A out is A's out-group payoff. That's what A gets from interacting with B. And pi out B is what B gets from interacting with group A. And the math is really complicated, but we work through the math, and what we get is this nice, beautiful little simple expression, this pair of simple expressions down on the lower right there, that anytime these two conditions are met, we get the stable emergence of cooperating competitors that shows up between species. So an example game that shows how this works, maybe in the birch fir case that I mentioned earlier, what happens in this case, and this actually does correspond with the real stories that we get from the ecologists like Suzanne Simmerd. Birch trees and fir trees, when they interact, they adopt actually specialized roles with one another. Birch trees send carbon through the root systems to fir trees in the summer when they are shading the fir trees. And the fir trees send carbon back to the birch in the winter when the birch don't have any leaves. The fir trees also derive an additional benefit because when the birch lose their leaves, they soak up the carbon, or they soak up the nitrogen, right, that is dropped from the leaves. What's going on here is that these two conditions are met because there's a type of division of labor that's happening. And these two conditions basically say anytime there's a division of labor, we might get something like this. That is, they are deriving more from their interspecific interactions than they're deriving from their intraspecific interactions. And the conditions are a little bit weird. It says, if you look over here, birch trees need to get more from fir trees than fir trees get from themselves. And the second condition is fir trees need to get more from birch trees than birch trees get from themselves, which is a little bit counterintuitive, but it makes perfect sense in the models. And then when we think back to the other examples of competing competitors in nature, coyotes and badgers, grouper fish and moray eels, this makes a lot of sense. So grouper fish and moray eels cooperatively hunt together in coral. They're occupying the same niches. They're going after the same fish. but nonetheless they cooperate together. The reason is they do better together than they do apart from one another. The moray eels can get into the coral and flush the fish, and the groupers wait outside waiting for the fish to come out. So the groupers do better when they hunt with moray eels than they do when they hunt with other groupers, and the moray eels do better when they hunt with groupers than the groupers do with other groupers, and so on and so forth. Right? So they do better when they work together than apart. Same thing with coyotes and badgers, because badgers can get into the holes that coyotes can't get into. Coyotes keep the critters in the holes if they don't leave. So we get this nice, simple evolutionary condition that helps us solve one of these outstanding puzzles in evolutionary biology. There we go.
Hi, I'm Sheila Winborn. I'm a religious studies faculty member in the department, and I do interdisciplinary courses. So my research is primarily on religion and visual culture, as well as on race. And my teaching is interdisciplinary within the areas of religious studies, philosophy, film, as well as I address issues of race and gender in each of my courses. So my courses consider the relationship between historical and contemporary approaches to film representations, including how historical films communicate prophetic predictions about how we currently live. My goal is to help students see the familiar anew. In the spring, I'll be teaching apocalypticism in film, which is one of the courses I teach the most. And I also teach each year, of course, the problem of evil in film, as well as science fiction in film, which is subtitled Moral Dilemmas and Ethical Analysis. And for in the spring, for the first time, I'll be teaching a new course titled Race and Religion in Film. And this course will be cross-disciplined for the Department of Philosophy and Religion and the Africana Studies program here at Northeastern. So currently, I just completed a paper titled Religious Truths Through Film, a mythical story, film as a mythical storytelling medium, and is subtitled A Pedagogy of the Other. The other projects that I'm working on are 2 books. The first, I'm completing the final parts of that book, and it's titled Behold It Is I, a theological interpretation of F. Hollanday's photographic representations of persons of African descent. And I'm in the process of finalizing it, as I said. Within this book, I focus on how at the turn of the 20th century, the American Boston-based fine art photographer F. Hollanday created a variety of representations of persons of the African diaspora, including the centerpiece of the triptych that's shown here in this slide, which is titled Armageddon. In my analysis of the centerpiece, I further uncover how Day represents his predictions that when Jesus Christ returns to earth to judge all of humanity, as is described in the Christian New Testament book of Revelation, that Jesus will return in the image of an Ethiopian monarch. I compared Day's idealized representations of persons of the African diaspora to the more pragmatic approaches of African American photographers of the same period, such as James Van Der Zee, as well as the various photographers whose works were included in the 1900 Paris exhibition that was compiled by W.E.B. Du Bois. The second book is currently titled The Problem of Slavery in Apocalyptic Films. And if I was going to give this manuscript a subtitle, it would be Cautionary Tales About What It Means to Be Human. So in this work, I explore questions such as, is slavery less of a moral concern when the slaves are represented as machines, animals such as apes, extraterrestrial aliens, or even the walking dead? Might our 21st century continuing fascination with all things apocalyptic be in part about self-destruction as a form of symbolic communal suicide, that some deem necessary if humanity is ever to fully experience a rebirth and emancipation from unjust systems, including systemic approaches to slavery. I also address a question such as this: how do the variety of ways slavery is represented in apocalyptic films relate to the contemporary facts that currently over 40 million documented humans live in various forms of slavery in almost every part of our world today, including some of them bought and sold for economic gains and living partly in plain sight in places in the US, such as Georgia and Massachusetts. This is the case although the United Nations has declared that slavery is illegal in every part of our world. Also, I address Oscar Wilde's quote. Oscar Wilde, the writer, once said that slavery is wrong, insecure, and demoralizing, that civilizations require the free work of slaves for economic gains, and thereby to do the ugly, horrible, uninteresting work. And he predicted that on mechanical slavery, our future depends. If Wilde is correct, what morally does this say about what it means to be human? Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name's Chad Lee Stronick. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy. I do philosophy. I teach technology and human values, and interdisciplinary course with a lot of computer scientists and people in science as well as philosophy. And I'll be teaching human rights as well next semester. So I'll tell you a little bit about my research interests and also just sort of the motivation for them as well. So I don't know if you also have a complicated relationship with your phone, the way it kind of puts you into a fugue state sometimes, and you scroll and scroll and scroll, and you find yourself coming out of it and being like, oh, I'm not doing what I really want to be doing. That's one of the kind of mysteries of, I think, what we're going through today, and that's something that I explore in the class. How could it be that you're doing what you want to be doing? No one has a gun to your head when you're scrolling your phone, but you're not doing what you really want to be doing. Like, what is that? So this kind of like conflict of ideas, this sort of paradox that we seem to be living through, is the sort of style that I take through my classes. So I'll talk about a paradox today. This one that's from legal theory, but actually has something to do with the way that we live in an increasingly data-driven society, that it's somehow due to the big data that's out there that we can predict all sorts of things about human behavior, about your own kind of life, or who we should admit to a preschool, or how much painkillers we should give in palliative care. These all are algorithmically driven kind of decisions based on a background philosophical idea that's at least worth scrutiny, worth giving it some scrutiny. So here's a project that I'm interested in that really gets at that question of, like, when is statistics meaningful? When is data something that we can trust? Like, not just whether or not it's right or wrong, but also just, is it epistemically good? Is it good information about the world? So let's take a big sidestep to legal theory and think about just the idea of, like, okay, well, you're in a court of law and some evidence needs to establish a certain standard of proof. What does it take for the evidence to establish such a standard of proof? And the lawyers will tell you, oh, well, it depends on, what's the context? Is it do you need an air of possibility? That's a standard. Or do you need something that's beyond a reasonable doubt, like in the criminal law? Or utmost certainty, an even higher standard? And a philosopher may walk into the room and say, well, what holds all these together? Why do these, what's going on when we ask, when does evidence suffice to meet a legal standard of proof? And things start to get really interesting now, because you might think, oh, here's what's going on. They all have some degree of certainty involved. And the evidence is helping to rule out alternative hypotheses in a way that can help you to kind of track what is most likely to be true, or what can support a high confidence in the truth of some propositions rather than others. That's a really, we'll call this probabilistic proof. And now, to give you a sense of the style that I take in my courses, it's going to involve a lot of principle. Oh no, they conflict. What do we do now? That's the kind of style. So in this case, we have probabilistic proof is the principle, and it says that all of these legal standards of proof can be reduced to some threshold of probabilities given the evidence. And that seems to be nice and natural. It coheres with the idea of, the sciences, and it's also in the background of a lot of these algorithmic decision-making tools that, are being used for guiding sentencing decisions, predictive policing, and so many other applications that we're still grappling with. The trouble with this is that it leads to badly formatted, what's going on here? A badly formatted paradox, which is the statistical proof paradox. I won't bother you with it exactly, but the conclusion is troubling. So like any good paradox, it has some natural, highly kind of acceptable premises, and then it leads to a conclusion that just doesn't feel very good. It feels unacceptable, and we've been led to a position now we have to either deny, out of the camera, that we either have to learn to live with, or we need to reject one of the principles that led us to this conclusion. A lot of people reject the conclusion. They say that it's not a crime to belong to a reference class, that you can't be found guilty on the basis of the kind of group you belong to alone, that maybe the group is statistically correlated with certain kinds of criminal behavior. Think about profiling, racial profiling, and certainly these kinds of egregious cases of misuse of information. That kind of evidence just isn't enough. You need additional individualized evidence, is the idea, that statistical evidence isn't enough. That's the kind of conclusion that leads us to reject, that's the kind of feeling that leads us to reject that conclusion. And most people in the literature that I'm interested in reject probabilistic proof. They say, nope, when it comes to the legal domain, there's a whole different set of standards. They're not probabilistic. There's something else going on when it comes to figuring out whether evidence suffices to determine whether someone can be justified, whether a defendant can be justifiably found liable for some criminal act or so forth. And in my research, I look at that second premise there, this idea that we can really get that much information out of statistics. And the strategy that I use, I don't know how much time I have left, but it's to look at the causal features of these cases. I'm being told I have 30 seconds left. So I'll be working on an AID group, which is AI and Data Ethics reading group. And we're going to also be having some works in progress come up as well, some speakers coming in. We're going to be exploring the question of, are statistics meaningful? We're currently looking at the idea of how do these systems that we engage with can affect our agency. We're reading a book. You can get a copy. I think we still have some if you're interested. These are all the broader, really rich research questions that I kind of broach as a kind of teaser in the technology and human values course, but with all the other faculty here, there are many opportunities to get into these sort of questions. So I feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. Thank you for your attention.
Buddy, boy, it's good to see people in person again at an event in the philosophy department. Taking a little inspiration from Jacob's presentation, I was trying to think, how did I benefit from the pandemic? And I in a couple of ways. In the darkest days of it, I got off social media and I read the early dialogues of Plato again, which I hadn't really done since graduate school. And that kind of saved me. That was the beginning of my coming back. So anyway, that's a benefit. And so I just want to tell you a little bit about my teaching and research that I'm doing. So I'm a logic teacher. And so I teach intro logic. I see some students here that are taking intro logic. I do that every semester. And then what I would like to do is just teach advanced spin-off classes from that. So the intro logic class has a deductive part and a probability part, an inductive part. And then there's a course now in the books called Advanced Logic, which should be called Advanced Deductive Logic. I need to change that. And then there's a course called Theory of Knowledge, which actually should be called Advanced Inductive Logic, at least the way I like to do it. So that's kind of that's how I see myself now, is as a logic teacher. And so this is those are the three courses that I plan on doing. So, when I got off social media, it gave me a lot of time, which I've devoted both to these courses and making YouTube channels, putting all my lectures on there. I'm doing that also for my advanced logic course right now. And then also I started doing philosophy more again. And so a couple days ago when I started thinking about this, I wrote down, these are the papers I'm working on. And, you know, look at that. It's kind of crazy. There's a bunch of them, and you'll notice they're all with different people. So for me, philosophy is a social activity. I've had, I think, 57 co-authors in my career, which is really a privilege. And here I have a bunch more, including Don Fallis, who's here. Don right here, who's running this thing. And then a bunch of other people around the world. And I'll be traveling again in the spring, so I'll actually get to see a lot of these people who I haven't really, many of which I haven't seen. Oh, I should mention, there's a Fulbright scholar visiting from Turkey named Professor Elgin. He and I are running a really cool paper right now on biological explanation and what's the role of a priori laws in biology. He'll be here all year. He's a really cool guy. If you get a chance, you should talk to him. Yeah, there's no unifying theme in this work. Basically, what happens to me is I meet interesting people who are thinking about interesting things, and then we get to talking, and hopefully a paper happens. That's kind of what I'm trying to do. Yeah, I'm not going to take you more of your time. Thanks for coming out today.
Okay. So this is the book that I've been trying not to write for the better part of my career. I'm just going to set the alarm because ADHD means I struggle with linear time. So, all right, I got 5 minutes. So I started in new religious movement studies, and it turns out it's not really a thing. But B, I early on got really frustrated with this category of cults for a number of reasons. The headline versions are, we use cults to describe either religious or ritual behavior that we find dumb or dangerous or predatory or irrational. No one uses cult outside like ancient religious studies to say anything positive about a group. And at the same time, it drives clicks, it drives headlines, it drives course enrollment. Ask me how I know. So I have been both yelling about why cult isn't a useful way to think about religion or what people do together for roughly 10 years now. While I was not writing this book, I have been yelling about why it's not a useful descriptor and why it's actually a damaging descriptor. So much that I wound up on the Wikipedia page for saying that cult means religion I don't like. Because the internet is weird. It is also kind of great though, because this also used to say that define the term cult when it was used by the layman. And then I complained on Twitter that that was sexist language and somebody magically fixed it. So like, come through the internet. Anyway, my first book, which just came out last July, nope, 2 Julys ago now, what is time? July 2020 with Rutgers Press, tried to think about religious minoritization outside spaces of new religious movements or cults. So I looked at 3 case studies where minority religious groups, American Muslims, Mormon fundamentalists, and Satanists, but an imaginary kind, because we're talking about the Satanic Panic. So this isn't like Satanic Temple or Church of Satan. It's Satanists that didn't really exist. And the ways that we use sex and sexuality and race to chill religious difference, basically. The way that we assume that if someone is doing religion outside cultural norm, which is very much informed by, honestly, white conservative Christianity, we assume that they must be doing sex wrong as well. And if they do sex differently, that probably means they're doing religion wrong and bad and in predatory ways as well. So thinking about like Mormon fundamentalists as a group that facilitate religious polygyny, the taking of more than one wife by one dude, for theological as well as sexual reasons. The state of Texas, in the largest custodial seizure of children in American history, used the practice of polygamy as evidence of abuse, and that's why they could go in and take the kids. Lots more to be said there. But part of the work that I was doing with this book is thinking about American minority religions as opposed to new religious movements, because the terms on which these groups are minoritized are very similar, despite the fact that Islam is the exact opposite of a new religious movement, right? So I wrote the book, that came out. I also did some yelling on my podcast, which I host with my friend and colleague Elise Morgenstein First. The podcast is called Keeping It 101. Right, it's like Keeping It 100, but it's a 101 level class. A Killjoy's Introduction to Religion. So we cover a bunch of basics in religious studies. And then Judith Weisenfeld, who is a she's an amazing scholar of particularly race and religious minoritization. She also doesn't want to use the word cult or the phrase new religious movements. She's also the chair of the Department of Religion at Princeton, and she asked us if we would do an episode on cults so she could use it in her own new religious movements class. So like, okay, fine, we'll do the episode. We did the episode. It's been cool to see it land with our colleagues because it means that folks who teach in these areas are thinking more critically about the way that they use cult language. I was like, cool, book came out, podcast came out, good to go. Don't have to have this conversation anymore. Except then I agreed to teach the cults and sex class here, which is really fun, I think, despite being also really deeply depressing. And it meant that, well, we were remote, so we're doing all of our conversations from a distance. I started a Medium page with my students. So rather than trying to do kind of live interactions over video, which requires everybody to have good broadband and good communication technologies, which not everyone does, we are writing out a reflection and responding to each other in this collaborative but asynchronous space. Part of the work that they were doing was analyzing pop culture around groups that get called cults, which means I was paying a lot more attention to cult media. Ooh, that was 5 minutes, that was fast. Anyway, I gave up. Now writing a book about cults. Leonardo DiCaprio is playing Jim Jones in a movie. When we talk about Jonestown, we talk about it like it's suicide. It's actually the mass murder of Black women, including this woman, Zipporah Edwards. And the book looks at basically who benefits from calling groups cults. So I'm looking at QAnon. I'm looking at the way that American Islam has been cultified. I am looking at the theft of bodies from the MOVE bombing. And I'm looking at the way that we misremember People's Temple. And that's the end.